Would you expand on assessing the merits of a single vendor approach versus a multi-vendor approach? With a multi-vendor approach, would that just not make things more difficult to manage with two separate solutions?
Gartner recently came out and said that I think it's 60% of all enterprises will have a single vendor SASE solution in the next couple of years. Going back a couple of years, you'd have had SD-WAN vendors, SSE vendors. There were some people who were already looking at having both ends of the service as different platforms. Mainly the security vendors who got into SD-WAN, they were already 2/3 of the way to having a cloud security platform anyway. So most of the main vendors you can imagine from a security perspective have got a SASE solution of some sorts. The networking focused vendors, they've all had to react to this sort of drive from Gartner and from the market. So there's been quite a few acquisitions in the last couple of years. Aruba bought Axis Security as a good example to give them that cloud security piece that they didn't have in-house. We're starting to see a lot more consolidation around that. Some vendors who are saying that they're not going to buy a networking vendor and they're never going to, probably are. They're just scrabbling around in the background trying to work out what vendor they're going to buy. Theoretically, you've got one portal. If it's a single vendor, you can combine that together and you can have one place to kind of, in effect, manage your security and your network and everything between. That works fine if you can find organizations where one person makes the decision across both contracts. One person runs both teams. One person has both the budgets for both security and the network. One person would benefit from having a team that runs two things rather than one. So what I've seen so far is it tends to be the organisations that have smaller IT teams. Doesn't necessarily mean small businesses, just smaller IT teams, where they're already doing network and security and there's one sort of central management point where they run both teams. From a design and from an operational perspective, they run both those teams, so they run both budgets. Then they can see consolidation and benefits because it's one less tool for their teams to manage. The challenge I find is the larger organisations with the more defined and evolved IT functions, where, for example, you have an architecture team for security and an architecture team for the network, and then you have an operations team for security and an operations team for the network. What's happened is the operations side has started to come together, but you'll still find very defined architectural separation. And they tend to have different budgets in different holders, and they report into different people. There'll be a single point at a certain level that they'll come into, but that's probably above the level where they care a lot about one less tool to play with down there and more about functionality and strategic direction. The challenge with a single vendor solution in those environments is the security architecture team will have a very defined set of things that they're looking for in a solution. The networks architecture team will have a very defined set of things they're looking for in a network solution. Now, you might luck out and find a solution that's a single vendor SASE that complies with everything. Fantastic. Chances are that's not likely to happen. And ultimately, you would be making some sort of compromise as an organization somewhere to go with a single vendor solution. Either the security guys wouldn't be happy because they'd lose some functionality, or it would be deployed in a slightly different way, or the network guys would not be very happy. So when you have quite a large IT function with those disparate, separate, defined architectural teams, it becomes harder because they've got more of a defined say. When it's one team who will look after network and security, they can have a chat with themselves and say, well, actually, I'll trade that off for that. And then, in effect, it's easier to come to a kind of status quo. I do think that moving forward, these teams are going to start becoming more integrated. I think what's happened is security is no longer a bolt-on to things, the network being one of them, or the users being another thing, desktop, workspace, all that kind of stuff. Security is inherently now part of things. It is being built into them. So it makes sense for the teams to in effect, push into one. But you're still going to have, at an architectural level, people who look at the functional pieces. At an engineering and an operational level, it could be one team. But architecturally, you're still looking at people looking at a security architecture team and the network architecture team. And whilst that's still around, it's going to be a very difficult thing to find a single vendor solution that ticks all the boxes for all the people. And the other the kind of holy grail of the planets aligning and the kind of two budgets being freed up at the same time because of a compelling event that hits both times. If you can find an organisation where their network and their security were bought at exactly the same time, so their contract end date is exactly the same time, that again is a kind of a blue moon moment. Realistically, their contract will stop theirs and their contract will stop over here. And again, unless you can keep the interest and try and leverage the benefits and potentially the cost models of a combined SASE solution, you haven't got compelling events that both get matched at the same time. So there's a number of challenges to single vendor. On the plus side, you get an integrated solution end to end. You've got a single pane of glass. There's the inherent benefits from a fully integrated solution in terms of stretching the policy down to your network and further if you have LAN infrastructure as well. And I think that's where things will go, is eventually this will break out from just SASE and we'll go into the LAN and Wi-Fi and then into things like multi-cloud, and then you will have user-based policies that will stretch across any infrastructure to follow that user around. So at the minute, it's down to use case. Again, everything's use case. Some people will find a single vendor SASE solution absolutely fantastic. It ticks all my boxes. It's a way of consolidating things and tools. I can drive my internal workforce to work with it. And some organisations will go, that's far too difficult and painful and a challenge to actually implement, because I'd have to placate them for not getting all of their toys and them for not getting all of their toys, to in effect force a single tool on them. So I think it will come more and more, but I think multi-vendor still has very much a place in the market for our users.